The wind whistled over the plains of West Texas, carrying dust and the scent of dried blood. From the top of a hill, Quanah Parker watched the glow of a fire on the horizon. It was an omen of the inevitable. In the distance, the echo of gunfire rang out like thunder tearing through the tranquility of the night. The U.S. cavalry advanced, wiping out the last camps of the Comanche Indians, while the survivors fled on horseback, trying to disappear into the vastness of the Llano Estacado. But they could not run forever. Quanah knew this war had begun long before he wielded a spear or rode a horse. His story was not just that of a chief, but of a son of two worlds doomed to collide. It had all begun in 1836, in a small settlement of Texan colonists near the Brazos River. The night fell without warning, and with it came the Comanche warriors, slipping through the shadows like ghosts. Within minutes, the settlement was reduced to ashes. Among the captives was a 9-year-old girl, Cynthia Ann Parker. She was taken far from her home, where the English language became a forgotten echo and her identity was buried under a new name, Najua. While the settlers mourned her disappearance, she grew up on the Texas plains, learning to ride bareback, hunt with a bow, and live as a Comanche woman. Over time, she married Peta Nakona, a respected Comanche chief, and had 3 children. Among them was a boy destined to change history, Quanah. From a young age, Quanah proved to be different. His eyes burned with fierce intelligence. His fair skin set him apart from the other children, but his skill with the spear and his bravery in the hunt made him a natural leader. He quickly earned the respect of his tribe, but fate had other plans. In 1860, tragedy arrived with the sound of gunfire. The Texas Rangers, led by Colonel Lawrence Sullivan Ross, attacked the Comanche camp without warning. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The warriors were cut down before they could defend themselves, and the women ran in all directions, trying to save their children. Among the prisoners was Cynthia Ann Parker, now a grown woman. For the Rangers, it was a rescue. For her, it was a death sentence. She was taken back to the white world, torn from her home, her husband, and her children. In her mind, it was not Najua being taken away. It was Cynthia Ann Parker, the girl who had ceased to exist decades ago. When Quanah learned what had happened, a dark rage ignited in his chest. He was only 12, but he understood perfectly what it meant. His mother would never return. 3 years later, Cynthia Ann died of grief, refusing to eat, refusing to live in a world that was not hers. From that moment, Quanah swore one thing: the whites would pay in blood. The wind swept across the Great Plains of Texas, carrying away the last traces of a scorching summer. On the horizon, the sun died behind a line of rolling hills, painting the sky a fiery red, as if the very land remembered the blood spilled on its battlefields. For the settlers, it was a promise of the future. For the Comanche Indians, it was a warning that their time was running out. Quanah Parker knew it better than anyone. He was born for war. Since his adolescence, he had fought alongside the fiercest warriors of his people, proving that he possessed not only the skill of a hunter but the mind of a strategist. While other chiefs resisted with traditional tactics, Quanah learned to move like a shadow, to strike and vanish before the soldiers could react. His first great test came at dawn on a silent morning. An army convoy moved slowly along the plains, transporting supplies to a nearby fort. Quanah and a group of Comanche warriors watched from a nearby hill, hidden among the dry brush. As the first rays of sunlight painted the land gold, the Comanches attacked. It was a surgical strike. Within minutes, the convoy became a moving graveyard. The horses fled in terror. The soldiers fell before they understood what had hit them. Quanah not only destroyed the caravan but left a clear message. The invaders were not welcome in Comanche land. But the greatest enemy had yet to show its true face, the buffalo hunters. From Kansas to Texas, hundreds of white men had arrived with one goal: to exterminate the American buffalo. Each hide sold meant the death of a sacred animal. Without buffalo, the Comanches could not survive. Without food, without hides for warmth, without tendons to make their bows, their entire culture hung by a thread. Quanah could not allow it. If the buffalo hunters wanted war, they would have it. He gathered the chiefs of other tribes and organized a campaign of terror, swift and lethal attacks. In less than 2 months, more than a dozen hunting parties were wiped out, the hunters killed, their horses stolen. The fires of the whites were extinguished one by one under the onslaught of Comanche warriors. But Quanah knew that small attacks would not be enough. He needed to strike a blow that would be heard across the territory. His target, Adobe Walls, a fortress of buffalo hunters in the heart of Comanche land. A well-defended stronghold with men who knew how to fight. A perfect target. Quanah knew that this battle would define the future of his people. If they won, the whites would learn to fear the Comanches again. If they lost, it would be the beginning of the end. With more than 700 Comanche warriors at his side, he rode toward Adobe Walls, his spear held high, the heart of a warrior beating furiously in his chest. Before dawn on June 27, 1874, 700 Native American warriors, Comanche, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho, waited in the shadows, ready to strike. Mounted on his black horse, Quanah Parker studied the silhouette of Adobe Walls, a small settlement of buffalo hunters that, in recent months, had become the heart of the destruction of the plains buffalo herds. Without buffalo, his people were doomed. This offensive was not just an act of war, it was a fight for survival. Quanah and his allies placed their faith in the vision of the Comanche shaman Isa Tai, who had assured them that the warriors were invulnerable to bullets. Victory was guaranteed. But fate had already conspired against them. Hours before the assault, inside the settlement, a sharp cracking sound startled the hunters. A wooden beam in the saloon suddenly broke. Fearing the roof might collapse, the men jumped from their beds, lit lamps, and started repairs. When the sun began to rise, they were not asleep. They were awake, with loaded rifles, ready for battle. Quanah raised his spear. The signal. The ground shook beneath hundreds of galloping horses. The native warriors charged forward, a wave of bodies and weapons surging down the plains like an unstoppable storm. Arrows whistled through the air, followed by the thunderous roar of muzzleloader rifles. But inside Adobe Walls, the buffalo hunters responded with brutal precision. The first lines of warriors were met with a hail of gunfire from Winchester and Henry repeating rifles. The bullets tore through the initial charge, but the warriors did not stop. Some reached the fort's gates, pounding them with the butts of their weapons, trying to break down the wooden structures. Others attempted to climb through windows, but were gunned down before they could get inside. The buffalo hunters, though outnumbered, were well armed and fortified. Every shot found its mark. The battle turned vicious. Near the gates, Quanah Parker led his men with ferocity, but in the midst of the chaos, a bullet struck his shoulder. The pain burned through him like red-hot iron, but he remained mounted, resisting the urge to fall. Blood soaked his shirt, but the battle was not over. 4 hours, the attackers surrounded the fort, searching for a weak spot. They tried to set fire to the buildings, but the thick adobe and heavy wood made them difficult to ignite. The defenders hunkered down and continued firing, knowing that if they fell, they would be slaughtered without mercy. As the sun began to set, the warriors withdrew to regroup. Quanah still believed in victory. But then, on the second day of battle, everything changed. From a distant hill, a buffalo hunter named Billy Dixon spotted a group of native warriors gathered in the distance. He knelt, raised his Sharps .50 rifle, a weapon capable of striking a man at extreme distances. He adjusted his sights, breathed, pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot vanished into the vast plains. The bullet traveled over 1,400 meters before striking a Comanche warrior. The attackers froze. No one on the Comanche side had ever witnessed such a shot. Some believed the buffalo hunters wielded magical weapons. Others began to question Isa Tai's words. If bullets truly couldn't harm them, how had that man fallen? Morale among the native warriors began to crack. Quanah Parker tried to keep his men together, but the psychological blow of that single shot had done its work. The siege lasted 5 more days, but the attackers were no longer the same. Meanwhile, inside Adobe Walls, the defenders received unexpected reinforcements. A convoy of hunters from Dodge City, which had been ambushed by the Cheyenne weeks earlier, arrived with ammunition and more men. Now, the garrison had over 100 fighters, and with enough gunpowder, they could withstand any further assault. Quanah Parker understood. If they continued to fight, they would only find death. On July 2nd, the last great Comanche siege against the buffalo hunters came to an end. Adobe Walls did not fall. For Quanah Parker, this battle was not just a tactical defeat. It was the beginning of the end. The buffalo would continue to disappear. The U.S. soldiers would continue their advance. And although his people did not yet realize it, the era of the Comanche as the dominant power of the plains was over.
Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave me your comment. Your support helps us keep growing to bring you more stories like this one. Thank you very much.
Winter, 1874. The air over the Texas plains was cold and cutting. There were no more buffalo. Where once they roamed in herds of thousands, only sun-bleached bones remained, their hides stretched out in white hunters' camps. The lifeblood of the Comanche people had been annihilated in a matter of years. Hunger loomed like an invisible enemy, deadlier than any rifle. After the defeat at Adobe Walls, Comanche resistance began to crumble. The U.S. Army, under General Ranald S. Mackenzie, executed the final phase of its strategy. Not just to defeat Comanche warriors in battle, but to erase them from the map. From Kansas to Texas, Comanche villages were destroyed, their horses slaughtered, their camps burned. Mackenzie understood that without food or mounts, resistance would be impossible. Quanah Parker, now recognized as the undisputed leader of the Comanche Quahati Band, moved ceaselessly. He led the last warriors of his people, seeking refuge in the Llano Estacado, a vast region of canyons and mesas where cavalry troops struggled to advance. Every time the enemy drew near, Quanah made his warriors vanish into the land. But time was not on their side. The winter struck with merciless force. Children died in the freezing nights, the elderly collapsed from weakness, and the women survived on whatever they could find. The U.S. Army had burned their food stores. Hunger was no longer a threat, it was a sentence. In September 1874, Mackenzie led his forces into the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, the final blow against Comanche resistance. The soldiers descended upon a hidden encampment without warning, burning teepees, destroying supplies, and systematically executing over 1,000 Comanche horses. When Quanah Parker arrived, he found only ashes and corpses. The winter of 1874–75 became the final test. The army no longer needed to fight. The cold and starvation did their work. For Quanah, surrender was never an option. But the survival of his people was more important than his pride. In June 1875, head held high, the scars of a lost war marked on his skin, Quanah Parker led the last free Comanches to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and surrendered to the U.S. government. It was not the submission of a defeated man. It was the decision of a leader who understood that the fight had to take another form. The soldiers expected to see a broken chief, a warrior who had lost everything. But what they found was a man with an unbreakable gaze, who refused to disappear. The era of war was over, but the battle for his people's dignity had only just begun. The roar of horse hooves and the whistle of arrows were now memories. The war had ended, but Quanah Parker was not a man who faded into history. If the battle for the plains had been lost, the fight for the dignity of his people had only begun. After the surrender at Fort Sill, the Comanches were moved to the Kiowa Comanche Apache Reservation in Oklahoma. The U.S. government saw them as a defeated people, destined to wither away in the misery of reservation life. But Quanah had other plans. Unlike other chiefs who struggled to adapt to the new reality, Quanah became a leader in the white man's world. He learned English, wore Western clothing when necessary, and negotiated directly with the U.S. government. Not as a beggar, but as a strategist. He became a successful cattle rancher, buying land and raising thousands of cattle. He rejected the idea of communal land that government bureaucrats tried to impose on reservations and convinced his people to accept private plots of land, ensuring they would not be stolen by speculators. In just a few years, Quanah Parker became the most influential Comanche of his era. He met Theodore Roosevelt at the White House, defended his people's rights, and refused forced Christianization. Instead of converting, he blended Comanche traditions with new ideas, creating a bridge between two worlds. But despite his success, he never stopped being a warrior. In Cache, Oklahoma, he built his home, Star House, a structure that symbolized his dual identity. A grand, 8-room wooden house, but surrounded by teepees for his wives and relatives, a home that was neither entirely Comanche nor entirely white. As the years passed, his health began to fail. His battles were long behind him, but the ghosts of his past never left his side. On February 23, 1911, knowing his time had come, he lay in his bed, closed his eyes, and let the wind of the plains claim him. His funeral was one of the largest ever seen in Oklahoma. Whites and Comanches gathered to say farewell to the last great Comanche chief. But Quanah Parker never truly vanished. For those who still tell his story, his spirit still rides across the plains, under the open sky, where he was once free.